Well, really what I'm going to do is basically start where Siobhan left off. I'm not going to talk about why we should do this. I'm going to try to talk about where we are now. What does a national child care program mean? And this is going to be the policy part. I'm a policy researcher, so there's going to be some numbers and policy in there. And then I'm going to talk about why 2015 is important for child care. Basically the how and why of how we can try to make this happen. And actually, before I really begin, I just want to start with a definition. When we say early childhood education and care, it's very confusing. Why do we use that sometimes and sometimes use child care? This term is aspirational, early childhood education and care. It means that it's the way we see it, but it's not the way it is. So we see it as care, and early childhood education should be one thing, the way it is in other countries in Europe. It is not about one size fits all, as you can see from the video. It means tailoring services to families' needs, and I'm going to say a few things about that. At this point in Canada, when we use the term, we mean regulated childcare plus kindergarten, basically. And I guess I use the term childcare because it's easier to say, and really high-quality childcare is early childhood education. Just ask any early childhood educator. So I want to go on, and I should have put that slide on. I wanted to start by talking about, in a little bit more detail, but quickly, about childcare across Canada today, as a way of setting the context. What do we have now? So we have no national program, and we have no federal role at all. Not a policy role, not a meeting role or anything like that. The federal funding is quite limited. It's all buried in other programs, essentially. And as Siobhan said, we're the last ranked country in OECD research and UNICEF research, both from the perspective of money, from quality indicators, and from families' access. So I call that child care condition stagnant. We're not going anywhere. Even in the area of what's called pre-primary, which basically means what we call kindergarten, but it's for kids 3 to 6 in a lot of countries. There was just a study put out by the United Nations last week where Canada is down to second from the bottom in the percentage of kids who are in those kinds of programs when you compare them to even developing countries. So we're often called a laggard, and the Toronto Star used this was a great headline in the Toronto Star earlier this year, "The baby boom meets the daycare bust." And I think of it as the daycare bust. One other thing that I want to discuss in slightly more detail and really emphasize is something that Siobhan mentioned, the $8 billion boondoggle that is not childcare. There was a report out from the Parliamentary Budget Officer 2 weeks ago that actually costed out these non-childcare programs at $8 billion being paid out in 2017 with the increase in the universal child care benefit, with income splitting, which I don't have to describe, but just say it would advantage very few people in this room. It would be at best for 15% of families, and it would be for most wealthy or affluent families. The universal child care benefit, which I thought was the worst piece of social policy I'd ever heard of until income splitting came along, is going not only to go up to $160 per child 0 to 6, but it's going to go up to 18 years old. It's a child care benefit. And you can just imagine those 17-year-olds going and getting their mustaches trimmed with the universal child care benefit money. It's completely ridiculous. But that's a federal initiative that is spending a great deal of our money. It's emptying the treasury. Now, just to move on to Alberta, I think this has kind of been said already, but Alberta has a less than 20% of center spaces to cover the 0 to 5 population. It's important to keep in mind that of those, more than half of them are part-day spaces, like a nursery school. So they don't serve the needs of working families, actually. The public spending in Alberta is below even the Canadian average. So I put Quebec on here so you could see that Quebec spends over $2,000 per child when you divide up the child population. Alberta spends $351. And keep in mind that even Quebec, when you compare it to the better European countries, isn't a really high spender. So we're very low down. Siobhan already mentioned that the parent fees are close to $1,000 a month. This is an average fee from 2014 that I'm showing. And staff wages in Alberta are below even the quite modest Canadian average, somewhat below the Canadian average. And the training requirements for educators in childcare in Alberta are quite low. Only a quarter of the people working in a child care center need to have early childhood training. So there's a huge recognition issue, as well as wages there. Two other things about Alberta that are important to keep in mind. The issue of for-profit childcare is a very important one for the childcare movement and for the labor movement. Alberta, actually, about 50% of the childcare in Alberta is for-profit. It's not the lowest, which is 0 in a couple of the provinces and territories, no for-profit childcare, and it's not 80%. One province has 80% of their childcare is for-profit. What Alberta does have is a quite significant big box corporate childcare presence that's growing, more than any other province. It's kind of the heartland of this, and I think that's a very significant problem. And the last thing I want to say about Alberta is that most of the other provinces have actually established full-day kindergarten in the last couple of years. Alberta is one of 4 that has not, and that does definitely play a role in this. So what does this all mean in sort of more or less plain language? Well, we've used this term patchwork for years, and I thought it was really fantastically represented in this video. It is a patchwork. It's a whole bunch of bits and pieces that families, people here with children or grandchildren would know this, they have to knit them together all the time. It's not a system. What this means is that parents have limited options. Many of them the majority of them use unregulated care, and really by unregulated care, I don't necessarily mean the grandmother. I mean somebody that you find on the internet. Which often it's not a good childcare option. I mean, it's what people have to use, but it shouldn't be where children have to be for their early years. We know that the workforce is undervalued. It's not well unionized in most provinces, and it's very underpaid. The parent fees are sky high. The quality is uneven. And there is this issue of excluded populations who are particularly not in childcare. Indigenous Canadians, people with infants, children with disabilities, and families who work non-standard hours, which I'm doing a research project on right now, and I can tell you there is virtually nothing for families who work non-standard hours. So why is it that what we have now doesn't work? In a way, it's very simple. There's 2 reasons, really. The 2 blue ones over in the first column are that we have very weak public policy. This is a public policy issue. So we have nothing federally, and all of the provinces and territories, including Alberta, this is true of all of them with some variations, have weak public policy. None of them has a really well-developed public policy. The other reason is that our public funding, as we have already said, is limited, but it's also very poorly used. So if even what we have could be better used. And so those 2 things really make up what we have is a market, not a system. And that's the overarching reason that what we have doesn't work. We have private responsibility on the part of families. We have a great deal, most of our childcare is privately owned, and that means for-profit and non-profit. We have very little public childcare. There used to be municipal childcare in Alberta. Now there's a very little bit in 4 municipalities. And it means private funding, which means that parents are funding most of it. And this is the reason that Canada ranks very, very low on financing, access, and quality. It's pretty simple, actually. So I showed you this vision that tried to sketch out, this little video basically sketches out a whole policy paper that we wrote for a national conference. And essentially what it is trying to say is, these are the basic ideas behind this vision. One of the things that it says is that early childhood education and care should be for all children, all families. In 2020, our 2020, it would be. It would mean that care and early childhood education are not separated. They're one thing. It would mean that it's a public good, not a commodity. It would mean that it's a shared responsibility between public, the government, and private, the family. And it also means, and I think this is fundamentally important, that it would be a necessary and valued part of our social infrastructure, as is public education. You don't imagine giving people a check to get them to go around and put together their checks to make a school. It's part of the infrastructure, and that's the way we have to see childcare. Now, what would this mean practically from the perspective of parents who are trying to work, children and so on? It would mean that there would be enough spaces, which would take some time to grow. It would mean that they were affordable, which could be done in a variety of ways. It would mean that they would be high quality. High quality means fundamentally the main element in high quality, not the only one, but the key one, is that you have professional early childhood educators who have decent jobs, decent wages, and are recognized for the value of their work. It would mean that our services would be public and nonprofit, absolutely. It would mean that we had much more public management and planning. And when I say planning, I mean things like, for example, that if there's a new subdivision in Calgary being built, you can see there's all kinds of new housing built, there would be a public responsibility to make sure that there's childcare is built right into that new subdivision. It would mean managing the money in a completely different way so that it's actually treated as a public service. Public management is a very key part of moving away from making it into a system, not a market, which is really what the goal is. Now, I think I'm almost finished with the policy part here, so I just have to flip on to, in order to make this system, the building blocks of such a system. So we tried to show this in the video, that one of the components of a system would mean that we would need a national policy framework. And you can see that little bed in the picture. I don't know if you can see this, but it has as the framework is that there's a national policy framework. It would mean that there would be long-term funding. So it wouldn't come up every year in the provincial budget, is childcare going to be cut or is not going to be cut? It would be sustained to build a system. And the way it would be set up is that all the efforts would be oriented to building a system, not just opening spaces here, there, and then closing them down if somebody decides to close them down. Now, what would this take on the part of governments? I'm going to say a few things about provincial governments in a minute, but it would have to be a multi-level government approach like Medicare is. There would be federal leadership, there would be federal funding, and as I said, there would be a broad policy framework. But it would also mean that there would need to be excellent provincial, territorial, and Indigenous service systems, because they are the ones who actually have to do the real work of the design at the program level. From my perspective, as a person from Ontario, where we have a significant municipal role, that's a really appropriate role if you look internationally at where childcare is managed and planned, that the local government has a significant role. That used to be true in Alberta, but it isn't anymore. One of the reasons that's really important is because of the concept of democratic participation, that you don't want to set up a system that parents and educators don't have an integral role in. And that's the place really for them to plug in, is at the local level. So just to say that the devil is always in the details from the perspective of policy. This would have, here's some of the details. It would have to have guiding principles like Medicare does. The main two would be universality. It would have to build towards universality and include everybody and make sure that it includes everybody. Children with disabilities need to be fully included, and it needs to be affordable so that people could afford it, but you also don't want to target it at the low income. So you really want it to be, a universal system. And I should say about high quality, I was getting tweets from one of the Unifor sisters last night, like saying, don't leave out high quality. I can't underline how important it is that it's completely counterproductive from a research point of view to have childcare services that are not high quality. Siobhan called it educational. It means educational from a very, very early childhood point of view. It doesn't mean children sitting at desks and rote learning at all. I'm sure you all know that. But high quality is absolutely critical, otherwise we shouldn't bother. Another detail is that it needs to have a plan, a public plan that has long-term goals, short-term goals, and it has clear targets and timetables. Another important key detail is it needs to be a plan to move away from the market, and that includes so much provision by for-profit operators. There has to be a way of doing that, because in reality, you can't just shut them down when they play such a big role, because parents are using them. But there has to be a plan from how we're going to get from here to there. So I said we need public management, we need public funding, and we also need public accountability. And that means there needs to be public reporting, there needs to be data, like a census that collects information, there needs to be research, and there needs to be democratic participation as part of public accountability. So I think that's the end of the policy part. I just want to say something about provinces. Particularly timely because of the provincial election, and this is whenever there's an election, it's a really good time to bring childcare forward. Actually, all the things that I'm talking about actually apply to provinces as well. In fact, childcare needs both federal and provincial, territorial, political will and leadership. And we have to do advocacy at both levels. And we all do advocacy at both levels. The provincial governments can, and they need to act on childcare now. Quebec did act on childcare. They act in different ways. There's nothing to prevent them, but it also needs the federal government to come in and provide the glue and provide the money. But I think you have to do both things at the same time. And from the point of view of any province, what I would be asking for in a provincial election is, what will you do about developing solid provincial early childhood policy that has the same kinds of principles and elements that I'm talking about, that it needs to be universal and high quality from a provincial point of view also. So this is the time really to address that in Alberta. Now, I guess the question is this just a dream? I mean, is just this a figment of our imagination? This idea about Canada becoming Sweden is a bit of a joke. One of my students at Ryerson put up her hand after we talked about, the different countries and said, how can we become Sweden? And it's become a bit of a metaphor because Sweden is the gold standard in childcare. But I thought this was a really good comment from one of the Globe and Mail reporters who's written about childcare. She said, you have to think long term. Sweden may be the gold standard now, but they've been building it for more than 40 years. And that is true. It would probably take 10 years to really build much of a system in Canada. So this isn't an overnight thing. And I think, just for those who are interested, Sweden has wonderful childcare. This little boy, this is what kids do in childcare in Sweden. It's sort of so fantastic from an early childhood perspective, but the parents love it also, and it's affordable, and it's there for everybody to use. They get it by paying high taxes, high corporate and personal taxes. That's how Sweden has all of these wonderful social programs. So I want to talk a little bit about how to make change and what we're trying to do. Well, why is 2015 important, and how are we going to do this? So how do you make change? Well, you can have a revolution. That works. We've been having childcare demonstrations for as long, and I've been doing it for 30 years, and so have a lot of other people. They work sometimes. They don't really work. They've never really worked in a really big way. I thought we could try witchcraft or prayer or something like that. But in reality, what we're going to focus on is voting, because we have a federal election coming up. So that's really what I want to just spend a few minutes on, is what we're going to do at a national level to try to put this out there on the national agenda. And I should say, when I say we, this is a big we that I'm talking about. The starting points for this we are the Rethink Childcare campaign that made that first video, starring one of my staff and one of my students, by the way. The Rethink Childcare campaign has mostly been a labor campaign. I've been part of it and some others have been, but it's really, really the national unions who have carried forward the Rethink Childcare campaign. People may have had to do with it. The other thing that formed a starting point was, and this is where the childcare groups came in, was the Childcare 2020 National Policy Conference in Winnipeg that the video was made for, and all the kind of fleshing out of what the principles are and so forth and so on. And these two things have come together. There's a lot of overlap in people anyway, to come together and form what we're calling Vote Childcare 2015. And that's really what I want to talk about. All kinds of groups are involved in that. A lot of the unions in this room have participated in all these kinds of things. Some of the progressive think tanks, like the Broadband Institute, has been very helpful, and CCPA, and the national childcare organizations that are left standing after Harper's cuts, like myself, and the Childcare Advocacy Association. And the campaign goals are pretty simple. We want to win our vision of a national child care program in 2015. That's our goal. And as another important goal, we want to unite and build the child care movement. And as part of that, we want to develop a new generation of leaders, because we're all old. We've been doing this for 40 years and enough, you know, it's wonderful to do it, but there's a point where we really need to bring new people in, and we're looking for people. And by working together, we are going to try to make sure that our vision of a national child care program is heard loud and clear in the public, in halls like this, in like at the college discussion that I was at last night. We need everybody in this. And I want to talk a little bit about the messages. I have to say that in a way I was thinking maybe I don't even have to say that these are the messages, because I found this on the table here from, I can't see who it's from. Yeah. Everybody has one. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, well, that's what we're trying to say, and we haven't talked yet. So I think that this is the kind of thing that we're going to be trying to put forward as messages. First of all, that finding quality, affordable childcare shouldn't be a matter of luck. That is one of the main things that came out of the Rethink campaign. Everybody says it's a matter of, I was very lucky that I got whatever I got. And it's a matter of how we set our priorities, our public priorities. Another important message that we've already belabored, but would need more, is that we have to tell the public that building a child care system would benefit many more families than a $160 a month check or income splitting, and explain that. And we're going to do that from now until the summer, when the big check comes out. And we need everybody to understand that and carry that message forward. We need to say that public investment in childcare pays for itself, but it also creates a more equal society. And those two things have to be in balance. It's not just economic, it's equality. What we want to say as a value statement, and I think this is where Hassan really kind of laid the way, is the idea about the kind of Canada we want. That it's not divisive, that it's inclusive, that it takes care of its people, and that a vote for childcare in this election is a vote for the kind of childcare we want and can be proud of. So we're going to be telling people to vote childcare for a stronger economy and a better Canada. So just to kind of finish up here pretty much, I just want to say that it is really about how we see Canada. If we have universal childcare, it's a step towards inclusivity, equity, fairness, not towards the greater inequality that we're headed to. It means that we have intelligent public policy, not wasteful and foolish public policy, like the $160 check. It means that we're a country that values collectivity, not everyone for himself or herself. It's about looking forward to even the 20th century would be good, but really the 21st century, and that the day of Ozzie and Harriet, if anybody remembers what that is over, is long over. And the main thing that I really want to say is that 2015 is going to be critical for childcare and for Canada. If we don't get a government this time that is going to start the national childcare program that we need, we might as well kiss it goodbye. It's critical. And the results of this election are really up to us. So just to close here, I just want to just say a few things about childcare and the labor movement. The labor movement has been integral in having a childcare movement in Canada. If it weren't for the Labour sisters and brothers, we would have very little left. As long as I've been involved in childcare, maybe not as long as I've been involved, but from an early period, there were many people from the labor movement involved, and it's become involved institutionally, where it's become a major issue for the labor movement. And there is nothing, I mean, that is absolutely irreplaceable in the childcare movement. So I'm asking people here, sisters and brothers, to join this campaign organizationally, so your local can join it, the AFL can join it, but we need individuals, because we're going to try to run a national campaign by having local events, and we're going to need local people. There will be leadership in Alberta, but what we need is people to sign up. There are some sign-up sheets at the table in the back, as well as some flyers for the first event, which is the May Week of Action. We're calling that Childcare Part Spring into Action. And it's really only together that we can achieve this no little dream. This is not a little dream. This is a big dream. So I urge everybody to think about the Vote Childcare 2015 campaign and how you can participate and get involved with it. And thank you very much.
We can. You have a bit extra time.
Yeah, that's what it's